Before a person who prefers solitude ever understand themselves, the world has already spoken. Long before self-concept solidifies, external interpretation begins to shape meaning. Parents, teachers, relatives, peers, people who care and people who simply observe, assign explanations to behavior. A child is quiet, therefore they must be shy. They watch instead of immediately joining play. Therefore they must be distant. They pause before speaking. Therefore they must be unsure. These interpretations arise from the human impulse to categorize. We seek patterns because patterns help us understand. A label simplifies complexity. But simplification is not always truth. Quiet observation is not inherently shyness. Pausing before response is not necessarily insecurity. Human cognition operates on varied timelines. Some minds move quickly, favoring immediate verbal engagement. Others require additional moments to process information, to observe dynamics, and to respond with intentionality. Neither style is superior. They are expressions of diversity. It usually begins in small moments so ordinary they are rarely remembered in detail. A child sits among other children, not distressed, not withdrawn, simply watching. Their attention shifts across faces and gestures. They listen to tones of voice and notice rhythms of interaction. They are not rejecting participation. They are gathering information, understanding before action, orientation before engagement. Adults notice. Teachers might wonder if the child is lonely. Relatives may encourage more sociability. Peers may invite involvement, which is good and natural. Human connection matters. But if the child hesitates, that hesitation is often framed as deficiency. Why are you so quiet? Becomes a common question. You should play more. Go make friends. These statements are rarely malicious. They reflect genuine concern. Yet beneath them lies an assumption that quietness requires correction. Modern social environments reinforce this assumption. Many systems reward visible engagement, quick responses, energetic participation, and constant interaction. In classrooms, workplaces, and digital spaces, immediacy often signals involvement. The person who speaks first may be perceived as confident. The individual who reacts quickly may be seen as attentive. Speed becomes a proxy for competence. But human cognition is not uniform. Thought requires time. Understanding requires processing. Some individuals arrive at conclusions rapidly. Others explore ideas more deliberately, considering nuances before responding. This difference is not a deficit. It reflects cognitive variation. A mind that pauses before speaking may be weighing information, constructing a thoughtful response rather than an impulsive one. For the solitude-oriented child, external interpretation may conflict with internal experience. They are not disengaged. They may feel deeply engaged in observation, learning social dynamics in ways that are subtle but meaningful. They notice patterns others overlook. They remember details of conversations. They absorb emotional cues. Their engagement is internal rather than performative. Yet the external world often measures engagement by output: how much a person speaks, how quickly they respond, how visibly they participate. These metrics are convenient but incomplete. Human value cannot be reduced to speed or volume. A person who listens attentively and reflects deeply contributes in ways that are less immediate but often more profound. Silence, therefore, should not automatically be framed as a problem. Feedback accumulates over time. The child hears repeated questions about their quietness. They notice subtle expectations to be more outgoing. A label begins to form, not formally, but socially. Quiet becomes associated with shyness. Shyness becomes linked to anxiety. Anxiety is interpreted as a lack of confidence. None of these connections are guaranteed truths, yet repetition shapes belief. The child begins to wonder if something is wrong. This is the first internal split. Their lived experience is one of calm observation. They feel engaged in their own way, processing information and understanding surroundings. Externally, their behavior is interpreted as hesitation or disengagement. The narratives diverge. Children, especially, tend to trust external feedback, mirror provided by adults and peers, more than internal sensations. If the world consistently frames quietness as problem, self-doubt may emerge. To adapt, They may attempt performance. They speak faster than thoughts fully form. They join conversations midstream, hoping to align with group energy. They laugh at jokes before fully understanding them, signaling participation. These adaptations are understandable. Humans seek belonging. Social connection carries emotional significance. The child is not rejecting interaction. They are navigating expectations. But performance carries cost. Speaking before thoughts are complete can feel disorienting. Rapid participation may lead to misunderstandings. Emotional energy is expended in ways that do not align with natural processing. After social interaction, fatigue may arise, an exhaustion disproportionate to the event itself. It resembles cognitive overload, as if too many mental processes are running simultaneously. Solitude, in this context, becomes relief, not escape. Relief, a return to mental clarity. Thoughts complete themselves. Emotions organize. The nervous system stabilizes. This experience is often misunderstood. If the child feels better in solitude, observers might conclude they're avoiding social growth. If they enjoy quiet time, it may be interpreted as withdrawal. The child receives conflicting messages. Engage more, but also do not rely on solitude. Fit in but remain authentic. These contradictions shape early self-concept. The child may begin to believe they're inherently different in a negative way, not because they're flawed, but because feedback suggests deviation from expectation. Identity is not formed in isolation. It emerges through interaction with the world. If the world frames quietness as problem, internalization may occur. Yet human temperament exists on a spectrum. Some individuals thrive in constant social environments. Others require periodic withdrawal for restoration. Neither orientation is superior. They represent variations of experience. The solitude-oriented individual is not lacking social ability. They process information with depth and deliberation. Observation before participation is not disengagement. It is preparation. Over time, tension develops between internal processing and external expectation. The individual learns to navigate both realms, engaging socially when meaningful and retreating when necessary for restoration. This is not rejection of society. It is adaptation to cognitive and emotional needs. The challenge lies in recognizing that these needs are valid. Misinterpretation often stems from visibility. Internal processing is invisible. A person who reflects deeply may appear quiet, yet their mind is active. They may take longer to respond, but their responses are considered. These qualities can be strengths. Thoughtful communication reduces impulsivity. Deep understanding enhances problem solving. Emotional regulation supports resilience. The goal is not uniform behavior. Human diversity includes varied cognitive and emotional styles. Quiet observation is not a deficit. It is a mode of engagement. Solitude is not avoidance. It is a tool for restoration and clarity. Social participation is valuable, but so is reflection. Flourishing arises from balance. In these early moments of misinterpretation, self-understanding begins to develop. The solitude-oriented individual may not yet recognize their temperament as strength. They may grapple with external feedback, but awareness is a first step. Understanding that behavior can be interpreted in multiple ways creates space for self-acceptance. Quietness becomes trait, not flaw. Observation becomes skill, not detachment. The world will continue to explain individuals before they explain themselves. That is a natural aspect of social interaction. But explanation is not final. Human identity evolves. The solitude-oriented person, once misinterpreted, can come to recognize their cognitive style as valid and meaningful. They are not less engaged. They are engaged differently. Diversity of engagement enriches human experience. This is the foundation of the psychology of solitude preference, not isolation, but a distinct way of interacting with the world. Some people assume preference for solitude is purely emotional. They think it's about mood, social confidence, or choice. But psychology and neuroscience reveal something deeper. Human nervous systems vary in how they process stimulation. Imagine two individuals entering the same environment: a crowded room, a noisy gathering, or a fast-paced social interaction. For one person, the energy is stimulating. It provides input, novelty, and emotional engagement. For another, the same environment feels overwhelming, not because they dislike people, but because their sensory and cognitive systems register information more intensely. This concept is known as sensory processing sensitivity, a trait documented in psychological research. It describes individuals who perceive subtle details more vividly. Tones of voice, microexpressions, environmental changes, and emotional undercurrents. Their brains process a higher volume of input per second. More data, more nuance, more stimulation. That increased input requires processing. Like a computer handling large files, the system needs time, not because it is slow or inefficient, but because depth of processing demands resources. Human cognition is not a single-speed mechanism. Some minds prioritize rapid responses and external engagement. Others prioritize careful analysis and internal reflection. Neither style is superior. They are different operating systems. The solitude-oriented individual often experiences overstimulation in fast environments. Social gatherings, loud settings, or constant interaction can feel draining. This is not rejection of society. It is a biological response to input levels. When too much information arrives at once, the nervous system seeks regulation. Quiet spaces provide that regulation. Solitude, therefore, becomes a form of recalibration. In quiet moments, the mind organizes information. Thoughts complete themselves. Emotional impressions settle. Ideas connect in ways that were not immediately obvious. This process resembles digestion. Food does not become energy the instant it is consumed. The body breaks it down, absorbs nutrients, and converts it into usable resources. Mental experiences operate similarly. They require time to integrate. This is why some individuals feel clearer after periods of solitude. It is not escapism. It is cognitive restoration. The nervous system returns to equilibrium, allowing deeper understanding and emotional stability. However, society often misinterprets this need. Fast-paced environments reward constant output, speaking quickly, reacting immediately, and maintaining visible engagement. Silence can be mistaken for disengagement. Pauses can be interpreted as hesitation. These assumptions overlook internal activity. A person who is quiet may still be thinking. A person who delays response may still be processing. Engagement is not always loud. Depth is not always immediate. Psychological research supports this understanding. Studies on attention and cognitive load demonstrate that humans have limited processing capacity at any given moment. When stimuli exceed that capacity, performance declines, focus fragments, decision quality suffers. This is why environments of constant stimulation can reduce clarity. Solitude-oriented individuals naturally seek conditions that protect cognitive bandwidth. Predictable spaces, reduced noise, and time for reflection allow attention to remain intact. Ideas develop fully. Emotional responses become measured rather than reactive. The result is depth of understanding. This difference does not imply social inability. Many solitude-oriented individuals engage meaningfully when interaction aligns with their capacity. One-on-one conversations, smaller groups, or purposeful discussions often feel comfortable. The key variable is energy expenditure. Large, unpredictable environments demand greater resources. Selective engagement preserves those resources. It is important to emphasize, preference for solitude does not equal aversion to people. Human connection remains valuable. Relationships share experiences, and communication enrich life. The distinction lies in how connection is experienced. Some individuals thrive on constant interaction. Others thrive on meaningful but less frequent engagement. Both approaches fulfill human relational needs in different ways. The nervous system difference explains this variation. Understanding it reduces judgment. When solitude is framed as abnormal, individuals may internalize doubt. They might question their temperament or attempt to conform to expectations that do not align with their biology. This creates tension between external demands and internal needs. Recognition resolves that tension. Human diversity includes cognitive and sensory variation. Quiet observation is not deficiency. Deep processing is not delay. Solitude is not avoidance. It is a mechanism for restoration and clarity. This perspective allows individuals to understand themselves without judgment. It also enables society to appreciate different styles of engagement. A world that values only rapid response and visible participation overlooks the contributions of reflective thinkers, those who analyze, strategize, and create ideas that require time to mature. Solitude-oriented individuals often excel in such domains. Their capacity for sustained attention and internal processing supports creativity, problem-solving, and thoughtful decision-making. They observe patterns others miss. They explore concepts in depth. Their contributions may not always be immediate, but they are meaningful. This is the nervous system difference. Not weakness, not isolation. A variation in human experience. Recognizing that variation expands understanding. It allows individuals to navigate life in ways that align with their temperament. It encourages societies to accommodate diverse cognitive styles. And it reinforces a fundamental truth. Human flourishing does not require uniformity. Some minds move quickly. Some minds move deliberately. Both contribute to progress. Both deserve recognition. The solitude-oriented individual, therefore, is not defined by absence of social desire. They are defined by a preference for depth, reflection, and regulated engagement. Their nervous system processes information in a way that benefits from quiet spaces. Their cognition prioritizes understanding over immediacy. As years pass, something subtle begins to happen inside the solitude-oriented person. It's no longer just about how others see them. It's a cycle they quietly live inside. It does not begin with isolation. It begins with intention. They say yes to a dinner invitation, a birthday, a group outing, and when they say yes, they mean it. There's no deception in that moment. They care about the people. They want to show up. They want connection. But as the day approaches, something subtle shifts. Their body begins to anticipate the stimulation, the noise, the layered conversations, the social calibration required to track multiple people at once. They may not consciously think about it this way, but their nervous system does. Energy starts draining before the event even begins. They might notice a tightness in their chest, a heaviness in their limbs, a quiet thought forming. I don't know if I can do this. And immediately, another thought overrides it. Don't be dramatic. It's just dinner. Everyone else can handle it. So they go, and here's what makes this more complicated. They often perform well. They are attentive. They ask thoughtful questions. They listen deeply. No one sees strain. No one suspects cost. But when they return home, something in them collapses. They sit in silence, sometimes for hours, not scrolling, not texting, just decompressing, letting their nervous system settle back into baseline. And this is where the real conflict begins. Instead of relief, guilt appears. Why did that exhaust me? Why do I need to recover from something other people enjoy? Why can't I just be normal? This is a loop. Next time an invitation comes, they hesitate, not because they don't value the relationship, but because they remember the cost. So they decline, and then they feel guilty for declining. They imagine what others might think. She's antisocial. She doesn't care. She thinks she's better. Sometimes they begin to believe those accusations themselves. Over time, something subtle happens. They start confusing energy boundaries with moral failure. Needing space feels selfish. Declining plans feels irresponsible. Honoring their limits feels like disappointing others. So they override themselves again. They push past their capacity. They shrink their recovery time. They apologize for needing space that their nervous system legitimately requires. And here's a part that is rarely spoken aloud. After enough cycles of overriding themselves, resentment can form, not necessarily toward others, but toward the invisible pressure to operate at a pace that was never theirs. They may even begin to feel distance from people they genuinely love, not because love is absent, but because exhaustion distorts connection. The tragedy of this loop is that nothing is actually wrong with them. The problem is not solitude. The problem is miscalibration. They attempt to live at extroverted pacing and then blame themselves when their system protests. When this pattern continues unchecked, identity confusion can follow. They begin to wonder, am I avoidant? Am I socially anxious? Am I just incapable of closeness? But often, what is happening is simpler. Their nervous system has a different rhythm. And until that rhythm is respected before depletion, rather than after collapse, the cycle repeats. The shift begins when they learn to pre-regulate instead of post-recover, when they begin choosing selectively, pacing intentionally, and communicating limits without apology. The guilt starts to loosen. Solitude stops feeling like retreat and starts feeling like alignment. What makes this even more fascinating is the clarity they feel in solitude is not imagined, it's measurable. Research on cognitive load shows that when external stimuli decrease, working memory improves, focus sharpens, emotional regulation strengthens. The brain literally functions more efficiently under optimal stimulation levels. But because society glorifies constant engagement, people rarely interpret this clarity as evidence of correct self-regulation. And visibility changes everything. When they recognize the pattern, they can reframe it. Solitude is not retreat. It is maintenance. Social engagement is not weakness. It is connection only when chosen intentionally. The key shift happens when they stop asking what's wrong with me and start asking what actually restores me. That question removes shame from the equation. Clarity without guilt feels different. It feels grounded. It feels deliberate. And once that shift begins, the cycle weakens. Not because they stop engaging socially, but because engagement becomes intentional instead of compensatory. They no longer push outward to prove something. They engage because it aligns. They no longer withdraw out of collapse. They withdraw because they value recalibration. Because now solitude is not something they fall into after burnout. It becomes something they schedule before burnout. The push-pull dynamic softens. And for the first time, they stop fighting their own rhythm. This is where self-acceptance begins to replace self-correction. And once that shift takes root, everything else, relationships, work, creativity, starts to reorganize around that acceptance. The cycle doesn't define them anymore. Understanding does. At some point, the exhaustion becomes louder than the guilt. Not dramatic exhaustion, not a breakdown. Just a quiet realization that constantly correcting yourself is more draining than being alone ever was. For years, the solitude-oriented person has tried to adjust. They've pushed themselves to be more available, more social, more outwardly expressive. They've treated their need for quiet like a flaw that needs managing. They've framed solitude as something to balance out, justify, or even apologize for. But then something shifts. It doesn't happen in a single epiphany. It usually happens slowly. Maybe they read something that resonates. Maybe they meet someone who says, "You're not antisocial. You just think deeply." Maybe they notice that their best ideas, their calmest decisions, and their most authentic self always appear after time alone. And a new thought forms. What if nothing is wrong with me? That question is powerful because it interrupts years of self-correction. Instead of asking how to become more socially energetic, they begin asking something different. What actually works for me? This is the beginning of psychological alignment. Alignment is different from avoidance. Avoidance is fear-based. Alignment is self-aware. Avoidance says, I can't handle people. Alignment says, I handle people best in certain conditions. That distinction changes everything. When a solitude-oriented person accepts their temperament, their energy stops leaking into performance. They no longer feel the need to prove sociability. They stop measuring their worth by how many events they attend or how constantly available they are. And something unexpected happens. Their social interactions improve. Because now they're not showing up out of pressure. They're showing up out of choice. Instead of saying yes to everything and burning out, they become selective. Instead of long, scattered interactions, they choose fewer but deeper ones. Instead of forcing themselves into overstimulating environments repeatedly, they learn their thresholds. Energy management replaces self-judgment. That shift alone reduces internal tension dramatically. There's a psychological concept known as cognitive dissonance, the discomfort that arises when behavior conflicts with internal beliefs. For years, the solitude-oriented individual may have lived in that dissonance. They believe they should be more outwardly engaged, yet their body and mind consistently signal the need for space. Once acceptance enters the picture, the dissonance weakens. They stop fighting their own wiring. Solitude becomes intentional rather than reactive. It's no longer the place they collapse into after overload. It becomes something they schedule, protect, and respect. They might block out quiet evenings without guilt. They might leave events earlier without over-explaining. They might choose smaller gatherings without feeling inferior. And here's the paradox. The more they accept their need for solitude, the less extreme the withdrawal becomes. Because they're no longer swinging between performance and collapse. They find rhythm. Social engagement becomes sustainable. Solitude becomes restorative rather than defensive. Their nervous system operates within capacity instead of constantly exceeding it. There's also emotional relief in this stage. For a long time, they may have questioned their growth. If I prefer being alone, am I regressing? But acceptance reframes the narrative. Growth is not measured by how constantly stimulated you are. It's measured by self-understanding and intentional living. They begin to notice something important. When they honor their need for space, they show up more grounded in relationships. They listen better. They respond thoughtfully. They are less irritable, less foggy, less resentful. In other words, acceptance doesn't shrink their world. It stabilizes it. They stop apologizing for needing time to think before responding. They stop labeling themselves as distant just because they don't constantly broadcast their thoughts. They stop interpreting quietness as weakness. The internal dialogue softens. Instead of "you need to try harder," it becomes "you need to pace yourself." That voice is kinder. And when self-talk becomes kinder, identity becomes clearer. This is the pivot point in the psychology of people who prefer solitude. It's not about isolation. It's not about rejecting society. It's about recognizing temperament and working with it instead of against it. The world does not need every person to operate the same way. Some people generate energy through constant interaction. Others generate insight through reflection. When these differences are understood rather than corrected, balance emerges. Acceptance is not the end of growth. It is the beginning of sustainable growth. Once the solitude-oriented person stops trying to fix themselves, they gain something far more valuable than social approval. They gain stability. And from stability, everything else, relationships, work, creativity, boundaries, begins to reorganize in healthier ways. That's where the transformation truly begins. One of the biggest misconceptions about people who prefer solitude is that they struggle with closeness. But the opposite is often true. They do not struggle with depth. They struggle with excess. A solitude-oriented individual may not want constant interaction. They may not enjoy large social circles. They may not text throughout the day. But when they choose someone, they choose deliberately. And when they are present, they are fully present. They listen without scanning the room. They remember details most people forget. A passing comment about your childhood dream. The name of your dog from 5 years ago. The exact way you take your coffee. Not because they are trying to impress you, but because when their attention locks onto someone, it is undivided. For them, silence next to the right person does not feel awkward. It feels intimate, comfortable, grounded. They do not need constant stimulation to feel connected. In fact, they often bond most deeply in quiet spaces. Long drives, late-night conversations, shared routines. Parallel play where two people exist in the same room doing separate things. They may not have many people in their inner circle, but the ones who are there intentionally. Research on social cognition suggests that humans can only maintain a limited number of meaningful relationships at once, a concept popularized by anthropologist Robin Dunbar. While the average person may spread their energy across broader networks, the solitude-oriented individual tends to concentrate it. This concentration creates intensity. When they love deeply. When they commit steadily. When they withdraw, it is rarely because they do not care. It is usually because their internal battery needs recalibration. And here is something that is often misunderstood. They do not measure connection by frequency. They measure by depth, safety, and authenticity. They would rather have one conversation that changes them than 10 that entertain them. However, this depth can sometimes create friction. A partner who equates love with constant availability may feel confused by their need for space. A friend who thrives on frequent contact may misinterpret silence as distance. without communication, solitude can look like detachment, but internally, their attachment may be stable and unwavering. They often carry people quietly in their minds, even when weeks pass without contact. Connection for them does not evaporate with time. It settles. And when they feel understood in this rhythm, when someone does not take their need for space personally, their loyalty becomes one of their strongest traits. The solitude-oriented individual is not defined by what they avoid. They are defined by what they value: meaning, authenticity, and depth. These qualities enrich human experience, and they deserve recognition. For many solitude-oriented individuals, self-reliance begins as a solution. It isn't born from pride or rejection of others. It often grows from experience, moments where emotional or relational needs were met inconsistently. A child reaching for comfort and finding uncertainty learns a quiet lesson: I must handle this myself. This isn't a conscious decision. It's an emotional adaptation. The nervous system learns to regulate internally because external reliability felt unpredictable. Over time, self-reliance becomes a strength. It builds independence. It supports emotional regulation. It encourages problem-solving and inner stability. These qualities are valuable, but any strength, when taken to extremes, can develop a shadow side. The shadow side isn't weakness. It's rigidity, a subtle belief, often unconscious, that asking for help or emotional support signals vulnerability in a negative way, that relying on others risks disappointment. That emotional control feels safer than openness. This can create emotional insulation, not because the individual dislikes people, not because they reject relationships, but because self-protection feels safer. Psychology helps explain this pattern. Attachment research shows that early relational experiences influence how people approach intimacy and dependence. Secure experiences tend to foster comfort with both independence and connection. Insecure or inconsistent experiences can encourage heightened self-reliance as protection. This response is understandable. If emotional needs were once ignored or unpredictably met, relying on oneself becomes rational. The individual learns to trust internal emotional resources. Yet human beings are relational by nature. Emotional connection, support, and interdependence are not weaknesses. They are part of psychological well-being. No one is required to carry life entirely alone. The shadow side appears when self-reliance evolves into emotional distance. Not coldness, not aversion, but a quiet barrier. The feeling that vulnerability might create risk. This barrier can influence relationships. Friends may perceive distance. The individual might prefer to solve challenges internally. Small emotional disclosures can feel uncomfortable. Importantly, this does not mean inability to connect. It reflects a relational style shaped by history and temperament. Understanding the distinction matters. Self-reliance is valuable. Independence is admirable. But emotional interdependence is also human. Relationships thrive on exchange, not constant dependence, but moments of shared understanding, a supportive conversation, a trusted presence, the knowledge that others care. For solitude-oriented individuals, growth often involves learning that asking for support does not diminish strength. It expands it. Emotional resilience includes both internal processing and external connection. These are complementary skills. The shadow side of self-reliance, therefore, is not a moral flaw. It is an opportunity for insight, to recognize patterns without judgment, to choose connection when it feels meaningful, to remain autonomous while allowing emotional openness. This growth does not erase solitude preference, depth of thought, selective engagement, emotional regulation. It complements them. The individual becomes neither completely independent nor completely dependent, but balanced, capable of standing alone and capable of standing with others. Psychologically, this balance is powerful. It reduces emotional rigidity. It fosters authentic relationships. It allows needs to be acknowledged without shame. The child who once learned self-reliance as protection can evolve into an adult who chooses it as strength, while still embracing connection. This is emotional maturity, understanding the past, accepting present preferences, growing toward a future where independence and interdependence coexist. The shadow side is not something to defeat. It is something to understand. and understanding transforms it, not into weakness, not into flaw, but into insight, a deeper awareness of how human psychology adapts and grows. Every temperament carries strengths, and every strength carries a trade-off. For solitude-oriented individuals, one of the quieter trade-offs is social opportunity cost, because connection for them is not a strategy, it is a choice. They do not maintain relationships out of obligation or potential gain. They do not expand networks simply because expansion is expected. When they form connections, it is because something feels real, aligned, meaningful. Depth matters more than access. Authenticity matters more than leverage. This orientation preserves integrity, but it can also narrow exposure. In a world that often runs on visibility, informal networking, and casual relational exchanges, many opportunities arise through frequency rather than depth. Not every interaction is profound. Not every conversation is transformative. Yet some doors open simply because people were present and socially engaged. Solitude-oriented individuals tend not to move through environments this way. Imagine entering a new recreational space alone, a sports facility, a club, a class. Before arriving, there are no familiar faces. Upon entering, information is gathered directly and efficiently. A question is asked at the office. Instructions are received. The activity begins. The individual participates independently, focused on the task itself rather than on social integration. There is confidence in this, the ability to navigate unfamiliar environments without needing immediate companionship reflects autonomy. It shows comfort with one's own presence. It demonstrates self-sufficiency. But something subtle happens in parallel. While others may naturally drift into small conversations, exchange names, or form casual connections, the solitude-oriented individual may remain centered on the activity itself, not out of fear, not out of hostility, simply because social expansion is not the primary objective. The world is navigated directly, not socially. This is neither better nor worse. It is different, and difference carries consequence. Over time, selective engagement can result in smaller social ecosystems, fewer spontaneous invitations, fewer incidental opportunities that arise from loose networks. The individual is not excluded. They simply are not positioning themselves within broader relational currents. Their tolerance for transactional connection is low. They can participate in it when necessary. Professional exchanges, functional coordination, surface-level conversation for practical purposes, but they do not derive energy from it. When interaction feels purely instrumental, connection for gain rather than understanding, it can feel draining or misaligned, so they choose depth, and depth requires selectivity. Psychologically, this reflects value alignment. People tend to invest in what resonates with their internal standards. For solitude-oriented individuals, connection without meaning often feels like noise. They conserve social energy for relationships that feel genuine. This protects emotional well-being, but it may reduce social range. Here, the trade-off becomes clear. By not treating every environment as a networking opportunity, they maintain authenticity. They avoid performative engagement. They preserve psychological coherence. Yet some opportunities in life are born not from depth, but from proximity, from casual familiarity, from repeated low-stakes interaction, from the simple act of being socially visible. The solitude-oriented individual may not instinctively pursue these pathways. Again, this is not a flaw. It is a preference, but awareness matters. Understanding that selective engagement has both benefits and costs allows intentional adjustment when desired, not to conform, not to become someone else, but to occasionally widen the aperture of interaction when it serves growth. Balance once more becomes central, depth without isolation, autonomy without unnecessary narrowing, authenticity with selective openness to broader exposure. The solitude-oriented individual does not need to transform into a social opportunist. That would violate temperament. But recognizing the landscape of social dynamics allows conscious choice rather than unconscious limitation. Every psychological orientation shapes how a person moves through the world. Some expand outward rapidly. Some move inward and choose carefully. Both patterns create different life trajectories. The key is awareness. When solitude is chosen intentionally, it empowers. When social avoidance becomes unconscious, it restricts. The difference lies in reflection. And reflection, as we have seen, is often the quiet strength of the solitude-oriented mind.